Can you guys hear me in the AV booth? Vicky? Reed? Let Vicky know I have to restart my computer, please. Let Vicky know I have to restart my computer. Chapter 10? Yep. Hey, Rose. Good morning, everybody. Everybody okay? All right. Any day now. All right. It should be it. There it is. All right, we are in Zechariah chapter 10. We are going to finish this book. Lord willing, and the creek don't rise, as Grandma used to say. Didn't know what that one meant until I got older. All right, restoration of Judah and Israel. We are in Zechariah chapter 10. I think we read verses 1 and maybe even going on to 2 last week. And so we're going to pick up the context here in chapter 10, so-called verse 1. Ask rain from the Lord in the season of the spring rain, for the Lord who makes the storm clouds, and he will give them showers of rain to everyone the vegetation in the field. So we talked about last week the idea of the people of Israel being back in the land after captivity. Jerusalem is kind of rebuilt. The temple is definitely rebuilt at this stage in the timeline. And so they've been waiting for God to restore the kingdom, I guess is one way to put it, waiting for this messianic Davidic king to show up and to be able to be the ruler again, to them to have their own sovereign land and to be able to be blessed again as the promises were in that covenant. To kind of pan back a little bit, just for a touch, there's towards the end of Ezekiel, the end of Jeremiah, and the end of Isaiah, we had this whole relationship between the Israelites and Jehovah God being like a husband and a wife in a covenant marriage relationship, right? And so you've got this idea of them being unfaithful and being called things like an adulteress. Right, Doug? Is that 3 or 4? We got to count. It was 3? Okay. Weak. Just 3. So we've got this idea of this marriage relationship being kind of forfeited by the Israelites because the princes and the judges and the priesthood and the kingship, they were all unfaithful in keeping their end of the bargain, the end of the covenant relationship. And so if you'll remember from your own personal studies of those books, we actually have in Isaiah and in Jeremiah the idea of God divorcing or putting away his covenant relationship with the Israelites. And so that in and of itself is interesting because he's trying to relate to the people in dynamics that they already experience. So the majority of the people would have been married, just culturally. And so by God relaying himself as being like the husband and the nation being like the bride, putting them away for adultery is one of those kind of phrases that doesn't quite fit perfectly the idea of a covenant relationship between God and his people, but it was close enough to draw some characteristics that they would have understood. So they would have heard, of course, about divorces back in the day, and they would have had that kind of comprehension and understanding. And so for God to relate it in that way is more accessible to the people that were hearing and reading these prophets' writings. And so you've got this time period after this when they come back from captivity where it's kind of like God is re-accepting them as the wife in this dynamic, and that he's trying to kind of bless this union once again. So that's what they're looking forward to here in chapter 10. So in verse 2, we covered this a little bit. For the household gods utter nonsense. So the gods of the household, the little shrines we talked about last week. And the diviners, those that could say that they had the access to talk to those gods, see lies, they tell false dreams, and give empty consolation. Therefore, the people wander like sheep. They are afflicted for the lack of a shepherd. And so, this dynamic of God being the shepherd and the people being like sheep, needing that direction, is a consistent theme all throughout Scripture. We talked about Moses. He tried to, by his own power, his own will, overthrow the Egyptian empire and free his Hebrew people. He did one murder, and then he was afraid of Pharaoh, and he ran off. So he, of his own power, was not able to really be the redeemer that God was looking for yet. He had to go out and find Jethro, his father-in-law, and take care of his sheep for how many years, do you recall? 40. So 40 years of being a shepherd of these dumb animals to be able to be prepared to then be sent back to go save the Israelites. And we pick on the Israelites because we say they're dumb, but don't get it mixed up. That's the image of the church, right? So we have our great shepherd who is Jesus, and then we have the other shepherds over a local flock, which we call elders. So they are a part of all of us too. And so individuals are intelligent, are motivated, can be highly encouraging, but when you have individuals in mass and a group of people, sometimes our decision making is a little bit not what it should be, right? Is that clear, everybody? Not picking on you, picking on all of us in this group, so especially myself. All right, verse 3, my anger is hot against the shepherds, and I will punish the leaders. So that's that Hebrew parallelism that I talk about every single week, right? It's the idea of saying something twice in two different ways, the same meaning behind it. So if you're asking who the shepherds of the nation of Israel was at this point, it's the leadership. They're the ones that really are steering the boat, and they're steering it in an incorrect way. Because the Lord of hosts cares for his flock, the house of Judah, and will make them like his majestic steed in battle. So let's pause there for a second while we're pausing for random things. There was a promise made at the end of Genesis from this guy named Israel, also known as Jacob. Right? He's an old guy, got some kids, and he gives them an utterance of a blessing, kinda, but it's kind of an unusual one. It's not just passing on the blessing. It's the idea of also, through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, we would assume from the text, that he's also giving them some kind of prophetic vision of what their families, their tribes would end up becoming. And there's a bunch of little insights in there. Some of them were based on the actions of the original patriarch of that tribe, of that family, that clan. And some of them were about things that would happen in the future. The one that we always emphasize for good reason is talking about the child Judah, who is going to be from the tribe of Judah, right? So what can you recall about Judah specifically from the end of Genesis? Not everybody all at once. Okay, raise your hands.
Judah had the great idea to sell Joseph, his brother, as a slave to Egypt. brothers would bow down to him. He would be the big dog.
Okay, he'd be the big dog, kind of. There's one big one here that kind of leads into verse 3. If you can't recall specifically, I can tell you.
Okay, we can.
Okay, you got it, Lisa. A ruler will depart from between his feet, which is a very polite biblical way to put it. Anyone unclear about what that particular phraseology means? All right, his loins, is that polite enough? Okay, his descendants, those that would come from him biologically, there's going to be a leader or a king. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, right? So the idea is there's going to be some kind of ruler from Judah that's going to be pretty important. So we kind of fast forward knowing our Bible knowledge, and we see, well, we've got the first king of Israel named Saul. Where is he from? Benjamin, right? Not Judah, so he's not the important one. Where was David from? Judah, yeah, but he wasn't really the one that they're waiting for, right? The scepter shall not depart from Judah before that king is there. So we're looking at this and we're seeing the setup and kind of knowing the bigger scope of the Old Testament. We look at the idea of, all right, so Jacob, Israel had some knowledge about how important Judah is going to be. And isn't it a little ironic to look here in verse 3 and see, well, the house of Judah is still there. It's still established. It's still the ruling class. Jerusalem is in Judah, right? And Jerusalem is right there. It's pretty important. And so we kind of fast forward in our minds a little bit to like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we see, oh, there's this guy who's king, who technically on the supposed father's side and Mary's side come from the tribe of Judah, and they can trace their lineage all the way back to Adam and Eve. If you want to go that far, if you really want to go that far, you can. Jesus comes from Judah. So that's prophetic utterance from Jacob or Israel in Genesis is fulfilled kinda in David, but David even himself is not the real one. He's a type or an image, a shadow of this great king who would also be a priest and also be a lamb, this guy that fulfills all in all, who's preeminent, who's the best from the book of Hebrews. That's talking about Jesus. So God here is in this time frame still setting up that promise of this great Davidic Judah king who's going to be coming in the future and blessing all nations. So that's kind of where we're still setting up here in this time frame. Any questions about that? Comments? Okay. Verse 4, from him shall come the cornerstone. We'll pause there. I mean, if you know your New Testament pretty well, Peter talks about this, Hebrew author talks about this. The chief cornerstone is whom? Jesus. Why is the cornerstone special? Yeah, it's the main support, undergirding of the idea of a building. And so if you want to have something built like a temple, the cornerstone is important because it's the chief cornerstone that solids that foundation. From him, the tent peg, so we kind of see the imagery change a bit. From him, the battle bow. From him, every ruler, all of them together. So this a great messianic thing is happening again. They shall be like mighty men in battle, trampling the foe in the mud of the streets. They shall fight because the Lord is with them, and they shall put to shame the riders on the horse. So in this great coming kingdom, this Davidic a ruler is going to be there. He's going to be very important. He's the foundation for the entire structure of God's kingdom is the big picture. And there's not going to be an enemy that can overthrow him, is the idea. Which is what they want to hear because they just came out of captivity and they were whooped and they heard about their granddad and their dad's generation. They were all just, enslaved essentially. And now they're back with their own people in their own land, with their own temple, with their own God. And God's saying it's not going to be that way anymore, which is encouraging to them, but it would not happen, obviously, the way that they were anticipating, because nothing ever does when it comes to God. Yeah, they were prohibited, ideally, from having war horses because they shouldn't trust in those, they should trust in God, like David and Goliath of old, right? And then, of course, You have the wisest man who ever lived, a guy named Solomon, blessed by God with that wisdom. What's the first thing he did? Well, he made an alliance with Egypt, of all places, and got a bunch of horses. So, what a wise guy he was. So, anyway, verse 6. I will strengthen the house of Judah, and I will save the house of Joseph. I will bring them back because I have compassion on them, and they shall be as though I had not rejected them, because I am the Lord their God, and I will answer them. So, again, there's that husband-wife relationship reconciliation taking place. He's still their God as he is ours, and he's not rejected them completely, is the idea. And he will answer their cries as he always did. I mean, if you just read through Judges, you'll see time and time again the people rebelled, they went into sin, they had some kind of enemy opposing them, and then they cried out to God, and God said, I hear you. He raised up a savior or a judge to save them, and he did that, and then the cycle repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats. It may be in your own life, right? In our own lives, we have that same cycle, and that's just a reality of being human, working with a holy God. It's just the way it works, and we are thankful for his grace, right? Okay. Then Ephraim shall become like a mighty warrior, and their heart shall be glad as with wine. Does your heart get glad when you're on wine? Well, it seems like biblically they would have thought that maybe if you consume some wine, your heart gets glad. I don't know how they had that information, because as we all know. Well, I'll just leave that conversation for another time. Their children shall see it and be glad. Their hearts shall rejoice in the Lord. So encouraging messaging for the prophet. It's about time, if you think about it. We've gone through essentially the majority of the minor prophets. This is book number 11 of 12. And so far, this is kind of like one of the only glimpses of good news that they've gotten from a prophet. It's not just, hey, repent or else. This is now, hey, you guys have repented, and here's the benefit that will come from that. I will whistle for them and gather them in. It's the imagery of what? Calling them home as a shepherd would for sheep, right? I'm not sure if sheep call when you whistle for them, but that's the imagery anyway. Because I have redeemed them. Let's just pause. Redeem means what, literally? Saved, yeah. That's more, yeah. Redeem specifically means what? Buy back, right? So, again, keeping in mind here the culture in which they lived, the idea of redeeming is to buy something that belongs to somebody else. If we think about kind of metaphysical experience, then the idea is we are all slaves to sin. And God knows that, so he buys us away from sin by paying that debt for us that we could never really pay. And now we belong to him. So we are his property now. We are servants, slaves, if you will, of God, not of sin, is the imagery. And they shall be as many as they were before. Well, I mean, kind of, right? This is one of those things about God. Whenever he says forever and ever, well, he doesn't really mean forever and ever. He means what the language actually means. It means for the allotted time in which they were given. Same kind of thing that, okay, the people are going to be blessed again, they'll multiply again, and they'll be like they were before. Maybe not in a literal numeric sense, but in the idea of they will be their own sovereign nation. And then here's the juxtaposition to that, verse 9. Though I scattered them among the nations, so God gave them over to be taken captive, yet in far countries they shall remember me, and with their children they shall live and return. I will bring them home from the land of Egypt and gather them from Assyria, and I will bring them into the land of Gilead and to Lebanon until there is no room for them. So again, this idea of wherever they went, when they were dispersed abroad, they're coming back home. There is the literal sense in which that was taking place, and also the kind of spiritual sense in which that was taking place, even for us. No matter where we're scattered in our time of captivity, if you will, to the world, God wants to bring us back home. It's not a physical location he wants to bring us to, it's a spiritual state, but still that message is encouraging. Okay? Thoughts? Okay, verse 11. He shall pass through the sea of troubles and strike strike down the waves of the sea, and all the depths of the Nile shall be dried up. The pride of Assyria shall be laid low, and the scepter of Egypt shall depart, the ruler of Egypt. I will make them strong in the Lord, and they shall walk in his name, declares the Lord. So a time of blessing, a time of peace, a time of prosperity, a time of being shepherded by the great shepherd, the Lord, the creator of heaven and earth. That's a pretty big, encouraging message for what we call chapter 10. Okay, any thoughts before we go into more negative stuff, as we have to do, because the prophets talking to a lot of people. Anything else? All right, let's get bummed out. Chapter 11. Chapter 11. Open your doors, O Lebanon, that the fire may devour your cedars. All right, here we go. Too encouraging, had to go negative. So the cedars of Lebanon were quite famous in this region. I think we all know what cedars are, is that correct? Cedar trees? Yeah, best tree in the world, right? What? Well, okay. Fair enough, I suppose. They smell good. That's all I meant. But kind of a rosy, waxy color on the inside. You burn that and get the oily. Okay.
Zappin, Lebanon, where in verse 10, in the prior chapter, he's going to resettle them in Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
I guess this is after he's...
Well, you got to purge and make it clean first, right?
I guess so.
Yeah, you can't have family visit until you purge all the junk. All right, so he's going to purge the junk in chapter... Yeah. And whether or not we're talking about in verse 10 the idea of the land of Gilead into Lebanon in a literal sense, or just like come back home, is the idea. But whatever the case, here's the purging. Wail, O Cyprus, for the cedar has fallen, for the glorious trees are ruined. Wail, oaks of Bashan. Does Bashan ring a bell to you mentally?
Bulls.
The bulls of Bashan, cows of Bashan.
Cow.
Right? Remember that? How fun that was? Yeah. Anyway, if you don't recall, some more stuff for you to remember. Wail, O oaks of Bashan, for the thick forest has been felled. The sound of the wail of the shepherds, we know that means leaders, right? For their glory is ruined. The sound of the roar of the lions, for the thicket of the Jordan is ruined. So you got this lush land in which you have these trees being talked about, and they're being burnt up by fire, and people are really upset about that. So you've got two ways to look at it as far as I'm concerned. You got a bunch more than that if you want to go deeper. The first one is, these trees are important because they're an important economical resource for the area. These were people that were involved in timber. You got cedar trees that are expensive, and so if you want to build a structure of great importance, you have to go get some cedar and get some great trees to do that. A different way to look at it is, what do you think these trees were being used to produce from this region? And that's the real answer, I think. Idols. So you have these things called groves talked about in other books. And these groves, it's not like just an enchanted forest that you're going to. It's the idea of these altars being erected, usually on mountaintops, because that's how you get high to gods, as you go to the mountains, obviously. You got to go up to get to the gods, as we all know. I say that tongue-in-cheek because I've talked about the idea of every time a person goes to commune with God, they have to go to a mountain. You have to, because that's where God is. He's above that blue dome up there. There's all these little spots in it, and so we have to go up that way because that's where God is, in the heavens. And kind of a simplistic answer, but that's what we see. And so these groves that were made for idols, and they would build these gardens, ironically, to go to a garden to commune with God. It's almost like the people were kind of remembering back in the day, in Genesis 2 and 3, the idea of going to a garden to commune with God. However, the gods that they were seeking out were not the gods that actually made everything. It's the God that they would create for themselves and worship how they desired to worship a god. So if you've got the destruction of the economic resource of the area, you've also got a destruction of idolatry in the land, is the big picture. Right with me? That's kind of an easy answer to a question that I would have posed differently in previous books, but that's just the answer, is God saying, hey, the place where you go to make idols, it's not going to be there anymore. You're not going to be involved in that nonsense anymore. And they really weren't when it comes to the idea of going to worship another god. When they came back from captivity, that had been wiped out, essentially. Now, if you go big picture, did they have other things that they placed in the important place of God? Yeah, of course. We're human beings after all. But going after other gods that people would have worshipped in the land before they conquered it in Joshua, no, that's not going to be there anymore. That's when you see in Matthew, for example, when they go to the temple place, there's no idolatry around in the Pharisees and Sadducees because they learned the lesson from captivity. And they're trying to help God out by bringing about this messianic king through the Maccabean rebellion, for example. And God wasn't really giving them the political king that they wanted. They wanted that because that's what they wanted. But God's like, no, it's the kingdom's going to be a little bit different. It's not going to be just Israel. It's going to be Jerusalem, and then Israel, and then Judah, and then Samaria, and then everywhere else is where the kingdom's going to go. So that's that. Okay, the sound of the wail of the leaders, for their glory is ruined. The sound of the roar of the lions, for the thicket of Jordan is ruined. If the lions here, I mean, it could be just the idea of a political or military leader who is fierce. That could be one imagery. It would have been kind of on the nose, though, because they're coming away from Assyrian and Babylonian captivity, and then the Medo-Persian Empire sent them back. And if you're looking at Assyria imagery from back in the day and looking at Babylonian imagery especially, their mascot was a lion, right? So if you think about America as a nation, what do you think of? Bald eagle? Pretty iconic, right? Where did we steal that from, by the way? Rome. Rome's image was the eagle, right? Because they had their talons, and they were fierce, and they were swift, and they were above everybody else. So Rome was like, yeah, it's us. And so America's like, hey, us too, right? And, so far so good. Got 200 years plus, and we're doing all right. So the image of these nations like Rome and America, you think of eagle. If you think about Babylon, what do you think of? A roaring lion. That was their mascot, if you will. And so the sound of the roar of the lions, for the thicket of Jordan is ruined. I am burning out the idolatry that's among you when you were away in captivity, is the imagery that I see here in this text. Thoughts? Okay. Thus said the Lord my God, become shepherd of the flock doomed to slaughter. It's kind of like, what's the point? Right? That's kind of the imagery we get from verse 4. God says, okay, you want to shepherd some people? Well, then you're shepherding the people that are doomed to slaughter, to fail, to not make it to that promised land, if you will, because idolatry is still in their midst. Those who buy them slaughter them and go unpunished, and those who sell them say, blessed be the Lord, I've become rich, and their own shepherds have no pity on them. So the people are kind of in limbo here based on what the leaders choose to do with the people. For I will no longer have pity on the inhabitants of the land, declares the Lord. Behold, I will cause each of them to fall into the hand of his neighbor, and each into the hand of his king, and they shall crush the land, and I will deliver none from their hand. So, again, bummer chapter compared to chapter 10. We have the people here who are still being influenced by this great lion, by the idolatry they brought back with them, especially those that intermarried among those people when they brought them back to Jerusalem. God's saying that's not going to be the case. If you're not purified, you're not going to receive those blessings. If you try to play this game where you come back to the promised land and you worship God, and you also have a spot in your heart for these other gods that you brought with you, it's not going to go well for you. I'm not going to be your shepherd. I'm going to sell you off, and you'll be slaughtered. So I think God's being pretty clear he's done with this nonsense. And whenever God gets to that point, that's kind of a scary spot for someone to be in. Application, obviously, for us is when we say that we are servants of the Most High God and we are bought by the precious blood of Jesus, we better not be trying to deceive ourselves about where our alliances truly are. Allegiance truly belongs to Him and Him alone, because we've got some examples of people that tried to play that on the fence game and it did not go well for them. Thoughts about that? Okay. Verse 7. So-called. Can you imagine trying to read this book without book, chapter, and verses? Scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll. You know, this part right here. It's wild, right? It's relatively new, too. Like, we've had this for like 600 years, and that's really it. Book, chapter, and verse. How it's broken down that way. 600 years, not that long in Bible times, right? Wild. Who would have thought? So I became the shepherd of the flock doomed to be slaughtered by the sheep traders. And I took 2 staves, one named favor and the other named union. Now, if you have a different translation, you might not have favor and union translated. What do you have in your Bibles? What's that? Beauty and what? Bands. Okay. Anyone have a Hebrew word there or a transliteration of Hebrew? King James? Anybody rocking that anymore? In King James? Okay. Interesting. Because sometimes in the King James what they'll do is they didn't want to come down hard on one side or the other when they were translating from the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek into English. And so instead of just giving you a translation of what the closest word would have been in the English, they just kind of left the Hebrew word transliterated. So they would have taken the sounds that the Hebrew letters made, and then they would have just taken those sounds and make it into kind of English. And a lot of names are like that, especially in Isaiah. They just were like, well, we're not going to say what it really is because we're not really sure, so here's what it is. And people for generations have been just saying, here's the words. Hosea, for example, when he was told to go name his children certain things, we have in the ESV a translation of what those words in the Hebrew meant. And the King James, it would have had just the kind of the Hebrew-sounding names. And you have to figure out what that is. So anyway, one named Favor, the other named Union, and I tended the sheep. In 1 month, I destroyed the 3 shepherds. I became impatient with them, and they also detested me. So 3 shepherds. Well, we got a Bible number here, so you know what you have to do. Figure out what the Bible number means. It's either one thing or the other. So you got 3 shepherds. So what are we going to do with that? What do you do with that?
I thought 3 was God's number, like the Trinity or something.
Okay, it's God's number. You got completeness is the idea. We've also got 3 for us, body, soul, spirit. We're 3, God's 3. Interesting connection to make. When you have the Mount of Transfiguration, you got Peter, James, and John there because they were his best friends apparently. And Jesus was up there. And then you've got Moses, and then you got Elijah. So you got 3 up there as well. And then you got the voice from heaven, God himself, saying, don't worry about those other 2 guys. This is my son, hear him. Paraphrase. And then you've got 3 popping up all over the place, right? So if you want to go historical, then you could say, well, all right, 3, maybe we're talking about Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persian Empire. Could be the case. Or maybe he just means 3 in the sense of all the enemies. Maybe. So there you go. So we don't know is the answer. To say all that to say you should know that, because when you read those things, what's the point? Because you're going to find entire volumes written on what this means. And you have the historical people, like, okay, we don't have Caitlin here this morning, but I'll let her know later. The idea of Revelation, when you're looking at Bible numbers, you have to figure out what you want to do with it. If you want to go historical context and say, okay, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persian Empire, all right, that sounds good. What about Greece and Rome? You just ignore them completely? Because if you want to go historical context, then you have to ignore 2. So it's not really 3, it's 5. So if you want to take it literal, then that's what you have to do. In Revelation, talking about Babylon, that means Rome. I know that for certain. But John's not going to say Rome. He's going to say Babylon, because the people that would have read Revelation would have known these prophets very well from a child. So when they hear the big bad empire that rules over you and controls your life, there's a king that you have to worship like he's a god, he's saying Babylon because that's what took place. But the people that read it said, okay, he means Rome, the empire that we're under now. So you can't always go historical, and you can't go always metaphorical. It's somewhere in between, depending on the context. So that's why I go into that and say we don't know, because it really means what you want to get out of it. Not salvation stuff. Who cares? But just important to know, if you want to have that conversation, you need to know how far that conversation can go. And it can go pretty wild. I mentioned before, every time we have a new president, he's the Antichrist. And someone on TV is going to tell you why he's the Antichrist. He's the beast, because you get a mark on your forehead, you get a mark on your hand, and you can't buy anything because the economy is ruined. Biden is the Antichrist. Well, Trump was last term too. So that's what I'm saying. If you want to go historical, that conversation can get pretty convoluted before long. So knowing what side you want to come down on is important to have that conversation, because you're going to meet these people who have been heavily influenced by what they see on TV on Sunday mornings. So if you want to play that game, know what game you're playing, I guess. I don't like that game. Okay, so I said, I will not be your shepherd. What is to die, let it die. What is to be destroyed, let it be destroyed. And let those who are left devour the flesh of one another. I took my staff favor and I broke it, annulling the covenant that I had made with all the peoples. Okay? So it was annulled on that day. And the sheep traders who were watching me knew that it was the word of the Lord. So now we have the prophet himself taking these 2 staves and making an image for the people to see the message. So I said to them, verse 12, if it seems good to you, give me my wages, but if not, keep them. And they weighed out my wages. Interestingly enough, wouldn't you know, 30 pieces of silver. I think I've read that somewhere else. Somewhere, maybe this guy named Judas got the same thing. Strange, right? How ironic the Bible has some irony in it. What a weird coincidence. Okay, we're going to pause here for the morning. You got the idea, again, panning out for one small comment. You've got in chapter 10, hey, if you guys are purified and you guys come back to the covenant, if you keep your side of the arrangement, you're going to be blessed. You'll be brought back home. I will be your shepherd. You'll be my people. Things will be great. And then you got these places that were known to be hotbeds of idolatry, influenced by the big 3, whatever that means, the idols. And then you've got God saying, listen, if you're not going to change your ways, if that's going to be your heart, that's what it's going to be, then I'll just sell you off like a slave. So that's kind of their choice to make. Okay, pause here for the morning. Again, Zechariah coming to a conclusion, and then we're going to Malachi, and then that's going to be it. We'll go on talking about heaven and what in the world heaven's supposed to be and how much we know. And the answer is we know a little bit about it. Okay.